Good morning, everyone. Hopefully somebody will give me some kind of sign if they can hear me. My name is Neil Safier, and I'm associate professor in the history department here at Brown, and I am delighted to be able to moderate this second panel of the day entitled Migrant Resistances to Settler Colonialism and Racialized Discrimination in Latin America. Before I mention our speakers, I should also give a bienvenida a todos. This particular panel will also be bilingual in terms of the, not necessarily the presentations, but in terms of the discussion and questions and answers. So feel free to put your questions in either Spanish or English. Pueden poner sus preguntas en inglés o en español o en portugués, si quieren, y trabajaremos con esto. If you are interested in translation, you'll find an icon that you'll be able to choose a language channel at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can toggle back and forth between those channels if you wish, and there's closed caption as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce the first of our speakers, who is Cecília Rocha Carpiuc, a Ph.D. candidate at the National University of San Martín. She holds a master's degree in public policy and gender from Flaxo in Mexico, and teaches at the political science department of the University of the Republic, Uruguay, where she also coordinates a research area of gender, diversity, and politics. She's currently working on her doctoral dissertation, as I mentioned, about the collective action of multi-discriminated groups, studying in particular the case of domestic workers in Latin America, an extremely important topic. Her research also focuses on social inequalities, class, sexual diversity, race and ethnicity, migration and generation, regarding public policies in Latin America. Some of her latest peer-reviewed work has appeared in Politics and Gender and the European Political Science Journal. So with that, Cecilia, te damos la bienvenida. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Neil. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the presentation and this invitation. As Neil already told you, this is a part of my PhD dissertation on the domestic workers' collective action in Latin America. I'm going to share my screen, if that is okay. Okay. Please let me know if you see it correctly. Thank you, Neil. Okay, so white domestic workers are a multi-discriminated group because of the class, gender, ethnic, and racial hierarchies embedded in the occupation. Historically, domestic work has been a very important niche of employment for internal migrants, mostly young women moving from the countryside, and small villages to work in the capital city. But recently, in the context of an increased flow of intra-regional migration in Latin America, it has also become the main occupation of external or international migrants working in countries such as Argentina, Chile, and Costa Rica. Domestic workers are difficult to organize because they work isolated in private houses, and they have few resources to invest in collective action, and frequently they hold framings that deny themselves as workers. And migrant domestic workers are considered to be even more unorganizable. They face longer working hours and lack of days off. They confront restrictions to mobility because they usually live in the employer's houses. They are so socially isolated and more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation because they fear to be deported or losing their jobs. And they may have limited knowledge about labor rights in the destination country and even face legal restrictions to unionize. However, migrant domestic workers are organizing. In the last decades, we have many experiences going on in the United States, Europe, and also in Asia. In Latin America, domestic workers have been organizing for a long time now, but migrant domestic workers organizations specifically are still infrequent. So in this presentation, I build on previous works about this subject and on concepts of social movement, of the social movement theory, to analyze the formation of a migrant domestic worker union, the C9CAP, the National Intercompany Union of Migrant Household Workers. This is a sindicato, en español es Sindicato Nacional Interempresa de Trabajadores y Trabajadoras Inmigrantes de Casa Particular, a pretty long name. And this union is located in Chile, and it is exclusively integrated by international migrant workers. So in what follows, I will briefly present the C9CAP model of organizing, the main factors contributing to its formation, and I want to conclude by highlighting some lessons and implications for expanding migrant domestic workers' collective action in the region. So in terms of organizing model, C9CAP is very similar to other migrant domestic workers organizations in other regions. First, because it has a mixed model. It is a member-based organization led by domestic workers themselves, and it is also formally recognized as a union. However, its activities resonates more with an associational model, focusing on providing services and information, and most importantly, a socialization space for women to gather on Sundays, the only free day that they have because of being live-in workers. C9CAP's most remarkable characteristic is that it operates as a community of coping. Communities of coping are informal and oral-based networks supporting workers and providing them safe spaces where women can share their life experiences and the stories and vulnerabilities they suffer in their workplaces. So this dynamic helps the workers develop self-confidence and mutual trust, framing their personal problems as collective grievances and enhancing their sense of efficacy as a group. This help them to believe that they can change their situation if they do it together. And in this sense, it operates as a cognitive liberation process. The words of Rosa, who is the former C9CAP president, reflect very well this important role that affective politics and emotions have in this case of a study. So I will let you read the quote while I have some water. So our group is a hug. Nuestra organización es un abrazo. Is the main concept that Rosa is trying to tell us in this testimony. C9CAP is exclusively integrated by international migrant workers. This is a quite infrequent composition for a union in the labor movement in Chile. Although there are members from many different countries, such as Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia, most of the members of SINANCAP are from Peru, because it is the main country of origin of female migrant workers residing in Chile. In fact, the Peruvian community in Santiago de Chile was critical in many ways to enable the union start up. So the organization process of SINANCAP began in the Lima Chica, or the Little Lima. Lima Chica is an area located in Santiago de Chile's historical center, the center of the city, where different groups of migrants, but mainly the Peruvian community, integrate and carry out multiple social, economic, and artistic activities. Lima Chica worked as a weekend enclave, an accessible public meeting point that draws large numbers of migrant domestic workers and gather them on Sundays, helping them overcome the isolation they live in a daily basis. But Lima Chica only operated as a micro-mobilization context for collective action in McAdams' classical terms, when organizers activate these networks as a micro-mobilization context. Otherwise, these networks may only fulfill individual expressive needs of the workers, but not necessarily trigger organized forms of collective action. So in this sense, two actors were key, acting as political entrepreneurs of the SINANCAP formation. These political entrepreneurs inspire other workers to unionize and contribute with valuable resources to initiate the collective action. So the first important actor was a Peruvian domestic worker who became the first president of the union. Her personal story and background is very similar to that of other migrant domestic workers living in Chile. However, she had social and political capital. She was charismatic. She was a singer in those activities in Lima Chica, in the artistic activities. And she was very well known because of that. And she also had previous political experience in her country of origin, or as she likes to call it, a social sensibility. The other important actor is the Comité de Refugiados Peruanos, Committee of Peruvian Refugees. I think it could be translated like that. And the committee is a well-consolidated migrant social organization in Chile. It's an advocacy organization supporting migrants with legal advice and raising awareness about their rights, and also working in the area of Lima Chica. The committee encouraged domestic workers to gather together, making them feel confident that they could organize by themselves. And they also provide them with a physical space, a room to make their reunions, and legal and political advice on how to proceed in creating a union in a foreign country. In other regions, religious groups and churches usually are important actors in organizing migrant domestic workers. However, I didn't find that in the Chilean case in the last years. There is a Catholic group providing shelter, training courses, and assistance in job placement for migrant domestic workers in Santiago de Chile. But in the networks of that organization, migrants didn't build up a sense of community that is enough to trigger collective action. And this may respond to the approach that external actors may have towards migrant workers, because this religious group approach women as what other scholar Pande called the victimhood model, rather than from an empowerment approach that provides workers with a more political and right-based advocacy frameworks. So the case of Sina and Cap shows us that under very specific circumstances, migrant domestic workers can organize and sustain their organization's efforts in time, making a considerable improvement in the life of women who participate, especially in terms of recognition or feeling value. However, this case study also evidenced some challenges and trade-offs that I want to remark to conclude this presentation. First, the challenge to be seen and have a voice. Sina and Cap remains invisible to the most relevant social and political actors of the domestic work policy arena, even to other domestic organizations in Chile. They have several constraints to engage in lobby in activities of political incidents, because political actions occur during the weekdays, and negotiation in Congress, articulation with other groups, and the live-in modality hinders them to participate in that kind of activities. So they have very low political power to move forward their agenda in the political sphere. And here I found a crucial difference with the experience of migrant domestic workers organizations in other regions, because such as in the United States or in Europe, where they have resources to hire professional organizers or allow themselves to be full-time activists. And this is not the case in what I could see in Chile. The second challenge is more trade-off. In Chile, the labor movement and the migrant social movement mainstream position is that migrant workers should integrate themselves to the unions that already exist in their occupation, instead of creating a specific migrant trade unions. And in fact, in the beginning, the original group of women who formed Sina and Cap tried to develop their activism within another union of domestic workers, Sindu-Cap. However, leadership disputes, differences regarding the political orientation that the organization should have, and the feeling that their demands weren't prioritized, led them to drop out and form a specific migrant union. At that moment, in 2012, the migrant issue didn't have the political salience it has today. It is striking that after that failed attempt of collaboration, Sindu-Cap progressively became more open to this agenda, and it is now known as the reference in this matter. And to conclude, I don't know how much time I have, because I can't see Neil, sorry. Neil, please tell me if
Just another minute okay. Or...
Perfect, thank you. So the last challenge is, it has to do with intergroup discrimination. National domestic workers are not immune to the social prejudices and discrimination toward migrants that surrounds them. Of course, that is obvious, right? And what I could observe during field work were the conflicting narratives about this issue that circulate among other unionized domestic workers. In one same conversation, I hear these things, sorry. Some internal migrants fear that international migrants will take their jobs and initiate a race to the bottom of their salaries. Others resent international migrants for being preferred by employers who believe that foreign workers are more obedient. One of them even expressed her preference for having co-workers from certain nationalities and not others because of they being more clean or being more or less honest. And at the same time, other activists directly pointed how racist those comments were. So this is something that organizations are discussing, and to promote feelings of solidarity among domestic workers, some organizations are promoting a model, an organizational model, which has been called intersectionality as a social movement strategy. We can talk about this in the discussion, but this model uses various instruments, such as openly discussing these differences, conducting workshops about how the history of slavery, servitude, and colonialism still structures the politics of domestic work in Latin America. And I believe that further research on the efficacy of this model and exchange between activists and scholars about this subject and the possibilities to implement it in our region may offer an opportunity to prevent intra-group discrimination and construct a more inclusive politics of the margins. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, for that absolutely excellent and extremely not only intriguing, but just really opening so many different issues for us to discuss. I think that will undoubtedly connect with the other presentations as well. Lucila, if you'd like to put your, if you're going to share any images, you can do that while I introduce you, just to save a little bit of time. So now we're going to turn from Cecilia's presentation to that of Lucila Nejamkis, who is a Cogut visiting professor here at Brown. She comes from Argentina and is a researcher at CONICET and also associate professor at Arturo Jauretche National University, where she also directs a migration studies center at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín. Her work focuses on migration in Argentina and Mercosur through a variety of frameworks dealing with public policy, the state, nationality, citizenship, and human rights. And as I mentioned, she is here at CLACS as Cogut visiting professor for this entire academic year. Her presentation today will be entitled From Global Categories to Local Experiences, Climate Change, Gender, and Migration in Buenos Aires. Lucila.
Hola, Daniel, hola a todos, muchas gracias. Yo voy a hablar en español, pero la presentación está en inglés, así que es un mix entre todos. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. Esperen porque estoy escuchando a la persona que está traduciendo. Voy a poner off. Muchas gracias por la invitación antes que nada. Y esta experiencia forma parte de un proyecto más grande que se llama Estrategias Socioambientales para fortalecer la resiliencia de las mujeres trabajadoras migrantes del área Reconquista, pensando más o menos que la misma población, una población parecida con la que trabajaba Cecilia, con lo cual después vamos a tener muchas cosas que hablar, porque estas mujeres trabajadoras migrantes generalmente trabajan en las tareas de cuidado, ya sea remuneradas o no. Nosotros trabajamos con el género, la migración y el cambio climático, desde una perspectiva de entendiendo América del Sur, sobre todo con el neoextractivismo, ¿sí? El desarrollo neoextractivista, la sojización, ¿sí? Y el modelo agroexportador, en el caso de y ganadero, agrícola ganadero, que expulsa mucha población rural hacia las ciudades y expulsa a población de distintos países, en nuestro caso Bolivia y Paraguay, a partir de todas las consecuencias que los hombres y las mujeres generamos a través del antropoceno o del capitaloceno, ¿no? Sobre nuestras formas de consumo hacia las grandes ciudades, y muchas migrantes vienen del norte de Argentina, Paraguay o Bolivia hacia Buenos Aires. Las mujeres migrantes, ¿sí? Aquí viene una de las interseccionalidades, ¿no? Trabajan en nuestro territorio. Nosotros estamos trabajando en Buenos Aires, en el área Reconquista. El área Reconquista es una zona que queda cerca de la capital federal, y en el partido de San Martín específicamente, ¿sí? La migración que se da es una migración sur-sur, ¿no? Lo que para los estudios migratorios es una migración sur-sur e interregional. Esto se encuentra dentro del contexto de lo que es la feminización de la migración sur-sur, la feminización también de la pobreza, no solo de la migración, ¿sí? Los estudios de cuidado también, y este cruce discriminatorio que genera también que los efectos del cambio climático afecten más a las mujeres y a las niñas, como muchos estudios los han marcado, y bueno, genera una expulsión y una degradación del ambiente. Tanto en nuestro caso trabajamos con una doble hipótesis, que es en origen y en destino, porque estas mujeres vienen de lugares degradados ambientalmente para una agricultura familiar y autosustentable a la que estaban acostumbrados, zonas rurales, por las grandes empresas, y llegan a Buenos Aires, a una zona muy también degradada y contaminada, ¿sí? Yo ahora les voy a compartir un video, que espero lo puedan ver, para que ustedes vean imágenes también, y lo puedan escuchar sobre todo. Me dicen. Me parecía importante las imágenes porque, bueno, a veces hay imágenes que valen mucho más que 1000 palabras, se dice en el español porteño. Y con estas mujeres venimos trabajando hace más de 3 años en un trabajo interdisciplinario o transdisciplinario, desde biólogos, químicos, antropólogos, sociólogos, arquitectos, intentando no solo modificar, no solo trabajar con cuestiones de información, ¿no?, sino también de modificación de sus condiciones de vida, ¿no? En este sentido, queremos saber cómo afecta, trabajamos intentando saber cómo afecta específicamente a las mujeres migrantes en el acceso a derechos, ¿no? El cambio climático, cómo las políticas públicas también, cómo se relaciona las mujeres migrantes de esta zona con las políticas públicas y sobre todo las estrategias de reproducción de la vida, ¿no? Como los estudios de cuidado mencionan, ¿no? En estos contextos que son de una muy alta vulnerabilidad, y nosotras trabajamos con una intención de una transformación directa, porque tenemos una participación muy estable en el territorio con las distintas organizaciones sociales, ¿sí? Esto es la montaña, una montaña de basura, ¿no? Y aquí me interesaba traer una de las cuestiones, uno de los elementos dentro de las cuestiones interseccionales para pensar el cambio climático, donde también esto es el Ciance es el basural a cielo abierto más grande de la Argentina, uno de los más grandes, que recibe de los 32, 33 municipios de la ciudad de Buenos Aires toda la basura, ¿sí? Aquí se nos producía uno de los problemas cuando queríamos pensar de lo global a lo local, el concepto de cambio climático, que tiene que ver con, ahí está la planta de reciclado, la Bella Flor, donde trabajan, la mayoría son mujeres migrantes de Bolivia, Paraguay, el norte argentino, que es, bueno, la basura, un tema que trabajamos mucho, la basura como un problema, pero la basura también como una solución, ¿no? Aquello que los ambientalistas en muchos casos representan como lo nocivo y que en realidad es, ¿no?, para parte de esta población también es su trabajo, su comida, su acceso a un montón de recursos que de otra manera no los tendrían, ¿no? Ahí tuvimos como el primer elemento para pensar el cambio climático a nivel local, ¿sí? Como estamos en la cuenca de un río, del segundo río más contaminado también de la Argentina, por eso que yo les decía, pasamos de un lugar rural contaminado por agroquímicos, inundaciones, a otro lugar con una contaminación urbana, ¿no?, de la industria. Bueno, la idea es pudimos trabajar todo lo que tiene que ver con las estrategias de adaptación de las mujeres migrantes al cambio climático, con los conceptos de vulnerabilidad, amenazas climáticas y sobre todo teniendo en cuenta varios elementos que van en el sentido de la interseccionalidad, que en el caso nuestro, nosotros lo pensamos más desde la clase social, ¿sí? O sea, son pobres, y en Sudamérica la idea de pobreza reemplaza muchas otras interseccionalidades, ¿no? Como puede ser la raza, la nacionalidad es un elemento muy importante también. La etnia en un punto se convierte en aquellas o guaraní parlantes si vienen de Paraguay, o en el caso de Bolivia, de acuerdo al fenotipo, también hay una discriminación, ¿no?, si tienen un parecido más andino. Y el género como gran paraguas de toda esta mirada, porque son las mujeres migrantes las que generan estas estrategias de adaptación al cambio climático, ¿sí? Acá me interesaba compartirles un poco los elementos metodológicos, porque trabajamos con una coproducción de conocimiento, ¿sí? La idea con la que venimos trabajando ya hace muchos años desde nuestro equipo de investigación es ir en contra del extractivismo académico, ¿no? Esa idea de voy, saco una entrevista, me voy a mi casa, la analizo desde mi universidad calentita, sino que es, bueno, ¿qué es lo que estas mujeres necesitan, ¿no? No somos nosotras las que la tenemos que decir. En este sentido, la mirada de la basura va un poco ahí, porque para nosotros de clase media urbana, la basura es feo, es malo, ¿no? Cuando nos dicen que van a la montaña de basura a buscar cosas para reciclar o para comer, bueno, hay una mirada también puesta ahí que es necesario transformar. En este sentido, por ejemplo, trabajamos con un diplomado de educación, donde las mujeres eligieron qué era lo que querían estudiar, ¿no? Qué les interesaba, qué cosas les servían, por ejemplo, ¿no? Después trabajamos con la implementación de Action Learning, de Gender Action Learning, y con obviamente la investigación feminista que nos da estas herramientas interseccionales para profundizar un poco más el análisis de por qué el cambio climático afecta más en nuestro caso, en el caso de nuestro territorio, aportar a esta discusión a las mujeres y a las niñas, ¿no? Cómo el aporte interseccional o la perspectiva interseccional puede ayudarnos a ver esto, y cómo la condición de origen, género, clase, y también trabajamos mucho, sobre todo una de las personas de nuestro equipo, con la categoría de generación también, ¿no? Que también tiene mucho que ver tanto con lo migratorio como con el cambio climático, porque sabemos que las generaciones más jóvenes muchas veces son las que más conscientes están, por cuestiones también de educación, de lo que el cambio climático puede generar en sus vidas, ¿no? Entonces son estas mujeres migrantes las que trabajan en las estrategias de reproducción de la vida y en las estrategias de adaptación al cambio climático de los territorios en varios frentes, ¿no? Y acá yo puse How Understand Global Process in Local Context, ¿no? Porque nuestra gran pregunta era, el cambio climático es todo y es nada, ¿no? Si tuviéramos que preguntar a cada uno de los que está hoy mirando qué es el cambio climático, bueno, que aumente 1 grado la temperatura, que haya inundaciones, cada uno por ahí diría una cosa distinta, consumir alimentos con agrotóxicos. Y la idea era poder ver, en el caso de las mujeres migrantes, qué representaba para ellas, ¿no? Y en este sentido, desde la antropología, trabajamos mucho la noción de riesgo ambiental como subjetiva, ¿no? En el sentido de que tiene que estar situada. No es lo mismo el riesgo ambiental para estas mujeres del área de Reconquista, al lado del río, que para una persona que está en un edificio en la ciudad, ¿no? Y en este sentido veíamos 2 elementos que estuvimos trabajando de cómo traducir el cambio climático a lo local. Por un lado, lo que tiene que ver con las cuestiones de salud, ¿sí? Como los cuidados es el paraguas grande que tiene esta investigación, ¿no? Asociado también al género. Por un lado, todas las cuestiones que tienen que ver con salud, las mujeres las repetían permanentemente, problemas de piel, de los hijos, de los ancianos, de ellas mismas, por estar cerca del basural que contamina el aire, ¿sí? Por estar cerca del río, problemas gastroenterológicos, ¿sí? O sea, estomacales, muchos problemas digestivos también por la misma razón, problemas de piel, también por el agua que consumen, que está, no es potable para tomar. Y por otro lado, la asociamos también a las necesidades alimentarias, ¿no? A cómo el consumo genera la imposibilidad de el autoconsumo, si se quiere, de algunas cuestiones, o el autocultivo en los lugares de destino. Y las mujeres generan determinadas estrategias locales que tiene que ver sobre todo con los cuidados comunitarios, lo que nosotros llamamos cuidados comunitarios, que es una rama más de los cuidados, que tiene que ver un poco con trabajar en ollas populares, trabajar en comedores comunitarios, trabajar en el cuidado del barrio, o de los barrios, ¿sí? De los neighborhoods, limpiando. Hay una cooperativa, por ejemplo, de mujeres que limpian el arroyo, ¿no? Y sacan la basura que van encontrando en los arroyos. Y después un elemento más transformativo, si se quiere, porque la idea es también trabajar sobre lo transformador, que es ese conocimiento que las mujeres traen desde sus zonas rurales o desde sus países de orígenes, trabajando mucho con cómo incorporarlo a los países de destino, ¿no? Esto es poder trabajar con huertas comunitarias, donde se haya comida libre de agrotóxicos, ¿sí? Con la idea de soberanía alimentaria, que es otro de los elementos que, bueno, por el propio sistema capitalista atraviesa las cuestiones de cambio climático. Y estuvimos trabajando también en todo lo que tiene que ver a través de un libro, que yo hoy no lo traje, pero en mi próxima presentación voy a trabajar un poco con eso, que las mujeres que están estudiando en el colegio, que no han podido terminar su colegio secundario, su colegio, en las clases de biología escribió cada una historia sobre una planta que viniera de su país de origen, o de si era el norte de Argentina, una planta medicinal, y contar un poco su historia, ¿no? Y la compartiera, la hiciera comunitaria. A partir de ahí salió un libro que se llama Pojañaná, que en guaraní es Remedios de Yuyo, y esto tiene que ver con un poco poder también transmitir a las nuevas generaciones y que esto no se pierda en relación también a los cuidados de la salud, ¿no? Porque hay un montón de remedios propios, naturales, que se van perdiendo a lo largo de esa trayectoria migratoria y que, por ejemplo, en el caso de Paraguay, son muy consumidos habitualmente aún hoy en día. En este sentido, entendemos, para terminar ya, no me quiero extender más, tengo muchas más cosas para decir, pero lo hacemos en la discusión, que la cuestión ambiental o de cambio climático emerge en el discurso de estas mujeres directamente asociado con los cuidados, ¿sí? Sí, como otro elemento más de los cuidados, ¿no? Por eso nosotros hablamos últimamente de cuidado ambiental, porque si van en dirección de apoyar los cuidados, se va a respetar el planeta o el entorno. Ahora, si va en contra, no importa cortar un árbol, ¿no? Depende, tengo que cortar un árbol para tener leña, lo haré, ¿no? Y tengo que limpiar mi entorno para no tener basura, lo haré, ¿no? Pero en el sentido de lo local está pensado mucho con lo que tiene que ver con los cuidados. Por mi parte, estoy, y después para las preguntas. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Lucila, por esa segunda presentación extremadamente rica y tendremos muchas cosas que conversar. Yo creo que es muy interesante lo que dices también sobre las lentes diferentes que cada uno trae y cómo las respuestas a ciertas preguntas básicas cambia según la orientación. Entonces, ese tema también junto a las imágenes que mostraste, que realmente son increíbles, nos llevará muy lejos. Gracias de nuevo. For our third presentation, we have with us Miranda Cady Hallett, who is an associate professor of cultural anthropology and a human rights research fellow at the University of Dayton. She received her Ph.D. from Cornell in 2009, and she has published extensively on Central American migration and law in scholarly journals, including in particular a 2014 article in Law and Social Inquiry about the tensions and contradictions of the TPS program, as well as a 2017 piece in the Journal of Working Class Studies explicitly on migrant workers, exploitation, and resistance. Her presentation today is going to be entitled Representations and Realities, the Misrecognition of Indigenous Central American Women from Settler Colonialism to Human Trafficking. Miranda, please.
Thank you so much. Neil. And thank you to the conference organizers as well. And as for inviting me to this really fascinating conference. I've really enjoyed the panel so far, and in particular, as I'm pulling up my presentation here, I'll mention in the prior session, I thought Percy Hinson articulated so well that I jotted this down, right? He said, stigma acts in coordination with structural inequality to produce precarity for marginalized people, leading to their differential exposure to violence and death. And that provided such a great frame for, understanding our panel, which is more specific to gendered violence and women in movement, who are, just as Lucila just said, right, we're at the crosshairs of the feminization of poverty and structural exclusion, and the migration becomes one pressure point or friction point, a site of state violence, but also a site of these exciting forms of resistance. So really honored to be here at the conference in general and in this panel in particular. And just to confirm, I have 15 minutes, is that right? I can set my own timer here. All right, great. So I'd love suggestions on a retitling of this piece. So I'm feeling like misrecognition isn't quite the right word here, or it's gesturing perhaps to a whole set of literatures that I'm not necessarily familiar with or using. But anyway, so I'd love to have people's feedback, especially on my framing. This is a project or a component of my project that's sort of nascent at this moment. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your ideas about it. So the broader project that this comes from is a team project, including law school students and undergraduate students, as well as myself and some colleagues, to try to examine continuities of gendered and state violence for Indigenous Central American women, in particular as they relate to kinship and the manipulative use of kinship and kinship ties and emotions around kinship to control and aggress against women's rights. So we're examining, in this talk, I'll examine more the interaction between cultural narratives about such women, in particular, intimate narratives about their nature as mothers, sexual beings, and kin, and the structural forms of repression and dispossession that they experience over the course of their displacement and then seeking sanctuary or asylum elsewhere. So the methods we've used for this broader project, our team has been collaborating on this for a few years now, since 2016, really, and it's observant participation. So a little bit of a reverse of the traditional, I'm an anthropologist, right, and participant observation is pretty well known, but observant participation emphasizes the critical need to act with and in accompaniment with communities that are being observed. So prioritizing the participation and the action more than the observation, I suppose. So a little bit akin to participatory action research in that sense. So observant participation within networks of Central American women migrants and their families, often fragmented across borders, an examination of media and public rhetoric. For some reason, my last line is missing from this slide, but the last one is analysis of historical and cultural context as well. Okay, that's why it's on the next slide. So the methods draw on anthropology, history, human rights studies, gender studies, post-colonial studies, and something I've become really interested in the last couple of years and has been very useful in picking apart the political scene in my own home country of the United States, the political science of framing disinformation and the politics of racism and dog whistle narratives. All right. So one case that we've been involved with as observant participants is the case of Sarita Mendez Morales. This is a story that's been made public already. Journalists have gotten involved as part of her lawyers' advocacy strategy to get her released. But it's also a local story for me here in Ohio. So I'm at the University of Dayton. This individual is detained at the next county over in Butler County, Ohio for a couple of years, and I was visiting her there as well. So Sarita is an Indigenous mother who migrated to the United States. Her displacement was related to many factors, including the ways that she was forced to work from an early age, which of course had to do with the broader structural violence her family lived through. She was sexually abused as a young teenager and evicted by her parents, partly because she became pregnant early. She migrated to the United States and became a single mother for a time, but then moved in with a man who eventually began to sexually abuse her daughter while Sarah was undergoing treatment for cancer and became sexually unavailable to him. Due to a series of encounters involving language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, institutional negligence, and unadulterated racism, Sarita found herself in the process of trying to report the abuse of her partner against herself and her children. She found herself legally charged with child endangerment. So while she was trying to carry forward her case for asylum and sanctuary in immigration court, she was simultaneously kept locked up in criminal jail for a time, since she was given the poor advice by her lawyer, not realizing the immigration consequences of this decision, to plead guilty to this minor child endangerment charge. She found herself locked up not only in jail for that criminal charge, but then detained by ICE subsequently for over 2 years. And as a result, was at risk of losing parental rights over her 2 children that she was initially trying to protect. So that's, in a nutshell, Sarita's story. And this is, of course, only one way, one of many, many ways that Central American families are separated, and that women can lose their children, lose the right to live with them, or even have their parental rights terminated through the legal violence of immigration policy. And by using the term legal violence here, I'm referencing the work of Cecília Rocha and Lacey Abrego on the violence of immigration law. So reading these through, parents often migrate alone because the journey is risky due to illegalization of migration flows. Children can be sent alone if they're the primary target of persecution. Sometimes Central American children leave on their own without telling their mothers or the rest of their family. And once families living in the United States who have mixed status can also be separated through the actions of deportation officials in the United States. Even prior to the Trump administration, children were almost always separated at the border from anyone they were traveling with who wasn't a biological mother, including fathers, grandmothers, aunts, other caregivers, chosen family, etc., and provided with little to no agency over their own rights as children to live with whom they want. And then in 2018, very famously, and probably well known to everyone here, children were also taken from their mothers. The mothers were charged with the crime, which is how the children were taken away from them in the first place. And many eventually lost custody of their children or lost the ability to live with them. And the seizure of children was not an accidental byproduct, it was sometimes represented as such at the time by the Trump administration, but it was actually the strategic purpose behind the policy, as it came out very clearly later in, well-documented behind the scenes debates about how this was going to be carried out. So the key questions I want to explore, and again, I'm sort of just trying to wrap my head around these, is by what means are Indigenous women migrants culturally constructed as appropriate targets of such aggressive weaponization of state policy in ways that actually the courts subsequently found, right, that this policy shocked the conscience of the American public, right? So it was this egregious, spectacular, violent action, but at the same time, there were other elements of the public, a significant population, who were not outraged, but who saw this not only as rightful, but a sort of taken for granted rightness to it, right? Of course, these are bad women. Of course, they don't deserve having their children. So by what means has public consent been produced for, among some members of the US population for their degradation and exclusion and for assaults against their kinship ties and basic rights? And in seeking an answer to these questions, I found it really useful to look at the scholarship of law professor Letty Volpe, whose article, I think it's 2014 or 2015, I'm not sure on the year on that one, The Indigenous as Alien, usefully brings together the ways that the framing of immigrants and the treatment of migrants in the United States in many ways replicates and draws upon the treatment of Indigenous persons, right, as both excluded from the settler colonial imaginary of the nation state, as well as the work of anthropologist Shannon Speed in her 2019 book, Incarcerated Stories, Indigenous Women, Migrants, and Violence in the Settler Capitalist State. And, you know, I had this thought that there are these uncanny similarities between the cultural constructions of figures like La Malinche and the cultural construction of human trafficking in the current moment. For one thing, that they are both rather, well, that they are both contain multitudes and contain a lot of contradictory images and consolidate them into one sort of powerful image that can then be taken as an allegory and used by other groups in the construction of their own morality or lack thereof, right? Or the morality and lack thereof of other social groups. So they've become culture war figures in a way. But also because of the ways that they illuminate elements of settler colonial ideology regarding Indigenous women and Indigenous femininity, right? So just a few points on where I'm grounding myself in this settler colonial ideology. Following Patrick Wolfe, I'm understanding settler colonialism as really fundamentally based in a logic of territoriality, violent seizure of territory and dispossession, and elimination of the inhabitants. Following Ann Stoller, I understand intimacy and the disciplining and policing of family and sexuality as central to settler colonialism and the settler colonial project in the Americas. And then following Natsu Taylor Saito, I assume and frame this within a context where settlers continually, but often unconsciously, use violent strategies of replacement to exterminate and disappear Indigenous communities and peoples. And that violence is taken for granted as necessary, not because of any Indigenous people's acts of aggression, although there are many fantastical narratives that circulate that frame Indigenous people as invaders or as potentially violent and so on. But really it's their mere existence that is understood to be problematic to the settler colonial order. So I know I'm short on time. I don't have a lot of time to go into the La Malinche discussion, which is probably just as well, because I'm sure there are people in this audience who know a lot more about La Malinche than I do, and the ways that her significance has been continually redefined, appropriated, reframed, analyzed to death, and utilized by various social groups as an emblem, as a symptom, as a symbol of temptress, traitor, whore, an allegory of gendered Indigenous oppression, or sometimes elevated as a sort of figure, a trickster figure of individual brilliance who was able to be resilient and survive, right? So the narratives, there are some continuities and obviously some huge disjunctures with contemporary narratives about women migrants as and in relation to human trafficking discourses. So women migrants can be understood within human trafficking discourses, and sometimes the same woman, individual woman, can be understood alternately and contradictorily as a victim and as a perpetrator, as someone whose dangerously unbounded sexuality and movement of her body represents a threat to others, or alternately as someone with an object without agency whose commercialization of the body has been coerced by others and she has no choice within it, right? And it's within the magical and ritual spaces of immigration court that flip happens, that women migrants have a chance to lobby for their inclusion as this category of victim rather than as the category of the violator. But it's precisely in the case of the policy, the zero tolerance policy of the summer of 2018 that entailed the explicit removal of children from their mothers, all migrant children from all migrant mothers at the US-Mexico border. Women were precisely framed as smugglers. And that was the justification that was used for the removal of their children. So In a larger project, we look at the discourses from high-level political rhetoric all the way down to things that Border Patrol agents say to Indigenous women when they're removing their children from them, right? To understand how through these practices of enforcement and through the political spectacle of enforcement, this image of the Indigenous woman is reproduced in the public mind. So point one here, the strategic use of kinship ties and emotional anguish of child seizure as a mode of deterrence, that's been fully analyzed. And I think that's now a well understood part of what happened here. But the second component, I think, is what we're really trying to dig into and understand from the perspective of cultural construction, right? How the framing of these women as failures to live up to proper Western norms of sexuality in the heteronormative Western family invalidate their kinship claims to be a mother in the first place. And we're taking a reproductive justice framework that I don't have a lot of time to describe, but hopefully folks here are well familiar with that. And a lot of our, we point to the ways that the kinship violence women experience as migrants on the trail and then in their locations where they're trying to seek sanctuary replicates in some ways the violence they experienced at home and the symbolic basis of it, and how the resistance and resilience that we enact, despite the fact that I wholeheartedly participate in these forms of resistance. And, I also recognize that too often we can end up replicating settler colonial frames through our advocacy by stopping at the point of wanting to reframe women as decent mothers, good women, women whose commercialization of sexuality is not due to their choice, but is due to others beyond their control. So this, became very clear to me through the activist campaign around freeing Sarita, in part because as she won twice in immigration court, first as a U visa victim, T visa, excuse me, and then as a U visa for her assistance to law enforcement, I saw the ways that she was able to jump categories, but only by replicating and reinforcing dominant narratives about the appropriate morality of women that continue to marginalize and exclude other Central American women, right, through their construction. So her success was really built on a highly problematic binary that also has real consequences. All right, I have out of time, so I will leave it there, and with great thanks again for including me in this discussion. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miranda, for that really also extraordinary presentation. And it just strikes me that these three presentations together really take us, literally from one end of the continent to the other, and demonstrate, I think, also the interconnectivity, not only of categories and perhaps intersectionality, but also just in terms of these stories and the ways that they connect in terms of their identities. So we're going to open the floor up to questions from the participants. And as people are getting their thoughts together, and please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat. It did occur to me that, and this is sort of pulling things more toward the chronologies that I normally work with, which tend to be more on the early modern / colonial side of things. All of you made reference in one way or another, explicitly or not, to the fact, I think Cecilia, you began, to the fact that these categories of work and labor are coming almost directly from the colonial period, and how really what we're witnessing today has its basis in those original formulations and foundations. And it has always struck me that the way that we divide Latin American history writ large between a colonial and a modern period really does an injustice to how relevant each is to to the other study, for the colonialist to understand the ramifications of what happens in the modern period, and for the contemporary scholars to understand that the histories have a relevance to the stories that they're going to say. Lucila, you mentioned, the environment, which of course is beginning from the first years of the conquest. All of these different categories, Miranda recently as well. So anyway, just to throw that out there, there's so many other things that you will have to discuss between oneself, but I would love it if we could also eventually reflect on the colonial modern divide as well. So why don't we open it up first for the panelists, if you would like to respond or react to anything that was said by the other members of the panel, and then we can hopefully get some questions going as well. Cecilia, would you like to begin?
Okay, thank you. May I speak in Spanish now? Is that possible? Yeah? Okay, gracias. No sabía que era posible hablar español, así que disculpas por mi inglés. La última vez que hablé inglés fue en 2017 cuando visité Brown University. So, me encantó escuchar sus presentaciones. Me quedo pensando en 2 o 3 puntos principales en donde se conectan nuestros trabajos. En primer lugar, la forma de trabajar desde la academia con las comunidades. En ciencia política hay como visiones muy positivistas sobre estos vínculos. Entonces, escuchar las investigaciones desde abordajes de investigación-acción o de observación participante, donde realmente hay un involucramiento con las comunidades, siempre es un aprendizaje para mí, y en particular ha sido un desafío en mi investigación con trabajadoras domésticas, porque por la propia dinámica de su trabajo buscan desplazarse del lugar de ser tratadas como objetos de beneficencia, como víctimas, como personas que necesitan ayuda. Entonces es muy desafiante cómo poder acercarse y no hacer extractivismo académico, ¿no? Contribuir, colaborar, pero hacerlo desde un lugar de solidaridad, de igualdad. Creo que hay un desafío enorme ahí para seguir pensando en términos metodológicos y epistemológicos. Me parece muy importante lo que decía Neil recién al final de su intervención sobre los legados del colonialismo y la continuidad que hay con los tiempos modernos. Trabajo doméstico no se puede pensar sin el colonialismo en América Latina, sin toda la lógica de la esclavitud y de la servidumbre que afectaba a las mujeres afrodescendientes y a las mujeres indígenas en particular, está presente día a día en la relación con los empleadores y en las propias relaciones entre las mujeres. Por ejemplo, las migrantes del sur de Chile, entre ellas se diferencian según si son mapuches o mujeres indígenas, o mujeres del campo, pero sureñas, no mapuches. Y hay narrativas sobre quiénes son mejores trabajadoras domésticas, quiénes pueden hacer mejor su trabajo, o quiénes son demasiado sumisas y deberían ser más rebeldes. Entonces hay unas luchas allí que nos remontan claramente a las jerarquías que se establecieron en ese momento y que se siguen reproduciendo en situaciones de explotación y abuso que parecen sacadas de los libros de historia, realmente, y que siguen ocurriendo hoy en día. Me parece muy interesante en este sentido lo que traía la presentación de Lucila, de cómo en América Latina nos cuesta tanto pensar la racialización de la opresión y de la discriminación. Es como más fácil acá hablar en términos de clase social, de somos trabajadores, ¿no? O de género. La interseccionalidad llega hasta ahí, pero cuando hablamos de racismo, de etnicidad nos rechina, tanto en la academia como también en las organizaciones sociales. Y me preguntaba Miranda, quería preguntarte, ¿cómo es la relación entre las migrantes internas, en donde ustedes trabajan, las migrantes del norte de Argentina, cómo es su relación con las migrantes que vienen de afuera, con las migrantes bolivianas y paraguayas, ¿no? Si se reproducen estas lógicas coloniales y de racialización, o por el contrario predomina una solidaridad de clase y por compartir la condición migrante. Tengo más para conversar sobre la presentación de Miranda, pero no quiero hegemonizar la palabra, así que seguimos. Gracias.
Lucila, ¿te gustaría
Sí,
responder?
me gustaría. No, no solo responder, sino que también, bueno, pensaba esto de la dificultad, sobre todo de la academia, diría sudamericana, ¿no? Porque la del Caribe me parece que sí piensa mucho más las cuestiones de raza, ¿no? Bueno, pensar hasta la etnicidad, yo creo que llegamos. Y eso obviamente también tiene que ver con las cuestiones coloniales y también tiene que ver con las luchas de independencia, y bueno, obviamente. Yo voy a responder alguna cuestión que me dijo Cecilia, pero también le voy a hacer unas preguntas a Cecilia, porque estamos como en diálogo. Yo pensaba el tema de la concepción de trabajo doméstico, ¿no? Porque es un tema muy trabajado también, por lo menos en Argentina, y a través de la legislación, el autorreconocerse como, bueno, lo doméstico es difícil, ¿no? En el sentido de, bueno, si son trabajadoras, pueden ser, en Argentina por lo menos son llamadas de trabajadoras de casas particulares, y criticando un poco este término doméstico, que es un peyorativo. Yo quería saber cómo sus trabajadoras vivían este concepto, si lo habían problematizado o no, o bueno, somos nosotros los que lo problematizamos otra vez. Y por otro lado, quería preguntarle también, o aportarle, si es que no lo hizo, si había trabajado con los estudios que tienen que ver con las estructuras de oportunidades, ¿no? Que tienen que ver con cuánto el país donde las personas migran le da la oportunidad a esos migrantes de generar nuevas estrategias, generar nuevas alianzas, tener nuevos derechos, y cuánto traen cómo la historia política en su país también repercute en ese acceso a derechos, ¿no? No es lo mismo algunas personas politizadas ya en su país de origen que aquel o aquellas que llegan y no lo es. Y respecto, contesto rapidito, ¿no? A la cuestión de las migraciones internas, internacionales, sí que hay segregación, sí que hay discriminación. A ver, cuando se necesita solucionar un problema, hay unión y hay redes, ¿no? Y sobre todo un concepto que se usa mucho en Argentina de los feminismos, como la idea de sororidad, ¿no? Esta idea de ser sorora con la otra. Ahora bien, la discriminación está, la diferencia étnico, si quieren, racial, también está muy presente también por la población que viene, la cuestión también respecto a la lengua, ¿no? Porque el guaraní es muy, muy fuerte en la población paraguaya. Entonces ahí también hay otra discriminación. Pero se entretejen en las redes de los comedores, en las redes de género, de trabajo colectivo, también esto que hablaban antes de los derechos sexuales y reproductivos, ¿no? La lucha por el acceso al aborto, y un montón de temas que ahí no hay límite entre lo nacional y lo interno, ¿no? Pero sí hay marcas, sí hay marcas.
Cecilia, ¿quisieras tal vez responder rápidamente y después pasaremos a Miranda y podrías también incluir tus comentarios para ella?
Sí,
Que
sí.
me quedé muy interesado para saber, y seguro que Miranda también.
Muy, muy breve para dar abrir el piso a los asistentes. Sí, la discusión sobre cómo llamar a la ocupación es histórica, viene desde inicios del siglo XX, y las organizaciones de todos los países de América Latina y del mundo tienen diferencias sobre esta cuestión. En Bolivia quieren hablar de trabajadoras del hogar. En Chile hablan de trabajadoras de casa particular o de asesoras del hogar. En otros lugares se prefiere hablar de empleo doméstico o trabajo doméstico para visibilizar la noción de trabajo. Es la eterna discusión, y yo creo que de lo que habla justamente es de cómo pensarse en una relación de trabajo, y no de servidumbre, y no de deferencia, o en términos de toda esta construcción en torno a la lealtad, la obediencia, que viene de esa lógica más de esclavitud y servidumbre con la que está tan cargada la ocupación. Entonces, hay disputas sobre cómo nombrarse de la mejor manera para no reubicarse a ellas mismas, ni que sean reubicadas en lugares de subordinación, pero la mayoría de los trabajos académicos tiene como por costumbre usar el término domestic workers o trabajadoras domésticas, porque ha sido como se reconoció por la Organización Internacional del Trabajo en la conferencia 189 de regulación de trabajo doméstico en 2011, que fue una gran victoria de las trabajadoras, y allí se usa el término trabajo doméstico, entonces es el más, todavía sigue siendo el más difundido. Y me quedé muy intrigada de saber más sobre el marco de justicia reproductiva del estudio de Miranda. Con otra investigadora de Macalester College, estamos estudiando, tratando de traer ese marco analítico y de activismo, porque es un marco, tengo entendido, que es tanto de activismo como de investigación, para pensar algunas contradicciones que hay en América Latina. Por ejemplo, en mi país, en Uruguay, hay muchas legislaciones progresistas a favor de las mujeres, en violencia doméstica, en aborto, ¿no? El primer país en legalizar el aborto en América Latina, es muy progresista, pero hay muchas contradicciones en el acceso de las mujeres a los derechos en la práctica, y el marco de la justicia reproductiva nos está ayudando a entender esas contradicciones, porque estas políticas que suenan muy bien en el papel reproducen nociones de las mujeres, de las buenas mujeres, de las madres decentes, quienes tienen derecho o no a ser buenas víctimas de servicios de violencia doméstica. Entonces me parece fascinante y quisiera que nos contaras un poquito más cómo se está trabajando este marco de justicia reproductiva y qué tan extendido está la investigación allí en Estados Unidos. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Voy a cambiar y hablar en inglés. ¿Y está bien? But I really appreciated your follow-up on that. I obviously kind of cut myself short in talking about the ways that we're trying to understand this in the reproductive justice framework. But basically, we're drawing on the conceptualization of the Sister Song Collective about the right to have children being one of the more primary, problems of reproductive injustice for women of color, and that's been under-recognized by the white-dominated feminist movement. And this is, so we're trying to frame and understand the ways that women, Central American women, lose agency with regard to their relationships to their children through these forms of state violence that we can see as forms of reproductive injustice. And in that light, too, we've looked at the case that some of you might have heard of a detention center in Georgia, where Central American women were sterilized against their will and had their uteruses removed by a doctor who was working there at the center, right, who had removed the uteruses of several women. And very akin, actually, to a very similar case from the 1990s of an institution detaining adolescent girls whose sexuality was out of the normative bounds in Northern Ireland, right? Later it was found that many of them had their reproductive organs removed as well. So those are some of the dimensions we're looking at, some of the most kind of egregious forms of this violence, but then also trying to expand the lens and understand that these are not exceptional moments that violate the normal rule, but that the normal rule is the normal regime is one of reproductive injustice, right? And violence towards these women. And I think that does help a lot with, as you say, the progressive policies that are not realized in people's lives, right? We can see that in the US policies and the ways that they are framed in these allegedly, like, you know, to protect women or to protect their rights. But in effect, they are actually utilized within the broader society in these very repressive ways. And just quickly, there was a question in the chat that I wanted to respond to, and then I'll stop because I don't want to take all the rest of the time. And if I can find where I jotted down the question. It was about how do people become, how does race, class, gender, how does the indigeneity of Central American migrants become visible or not in the US context? Since the 1980s and the first arrival of what's sometimes called mass migration or a wave of migration, those are problematic phrasings, but at any rate, the first big wave of emigration displacement from Central America that came to the United States and created a stir within US political spheres, right? Since that time, there has been in public representations in films with Jack Nicholson and so on, a feminization of the imagery of the Central American migrant compared to the Mexican migrant. So the symbolic representation of migrants from Mexico is often male laborer, right, unauthorized, and the construction of Central American migrants much more often represented as feminine figures, sometimes domestic workers, but often also refugees, right? Refugees who are vulnerable women in need of protection. And as a component of that, indigeneity, particularly Mayan indigeneity, has been made visible as an element of that, or a signal of that vulnerability and belonging to that refugee category, right? Rather than the category of the transgressor. But so I think, and in many ways, maybe for one thing, Central American migration was much more marginal to mainstream US political discourse during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s compared to what it has been over the last 3 or 4 years under the Trump administration, I guess 5 years really since he started his campaign. And there's been much more muddying of the waters of that symbolic binary and sort of rapid fire shifting of dominant public narratives about who Central American migrants are, right? As powerful political figures have put forward the image of the MS-13 gang member as the potential quintessential, right, migrant from Central America. In that case, not at all racialized, not at all recognized as indigenous or colonized in any fashion, or not at all recognized as a refugee, right? And certainly gendered, but as masculine rather than feminine. So I hope that's good as a short answer for that question. And yes, I want to leave time in case there's other folks who want to speak up or have a comment or question.
Thank you, Miranda. I don't see any other questions. So if one of you would like to just kind of keep the conversation going. I mean, I do think just you know, the question of again across the whole range of your presentations, the question of identity and how that is mobilized and articulated in you know, diametrically opposed ways, sometimes within the same case. I mean, this was what was particularly striking to me, to hear this kind of, you know, way that certain individuals or groups are caught within contradictions that literally make it impossible for them not only to win their cases, but actually almost make it certain that they will lose, you know, sometimes doubly or triply. And so again, I think you know, I see all of your work as really trying to kind of pull apart some of the threads in each of these individual stories, but also complexify the individual stories so that all elements of them are present. And I think I'll just say, as somewhat of an outsider to this field, I think the more that you can bring these individuals and case studies to bear, whether it's Malinche or another, kind of symbolic case, that is hugely valuable for us understanding the complexities of these histories and the contradictions that many of them are caught within. ¿Algún otro comentario de ustedes para las demás?
Maybe I'll just give a plug for a book that not everybody might have heard of, and that I forgot to mention in my presentation and was highly influential. So just as a matter of citation, I should. So Lisa Marie Cacho, in this 2012 book called Social Death, Racialized Rightlessness and the Criminalization of the Unprotected. As the subtitle indicates, it really hones in on the role of racialization in reproducing very structural forms of marginalization. And so especially in relation to that question, like in Latin American studies, there is a dearth or a lack of explicit research that utilizes the framework of racialization. I think Cacho's scholarship offers a really useful way to do that. And it does so in the vein of pointing out how groups that are marginalized are constantly confronted with images of the ideal cultural subject and the ideal moral subject that they cannot possibly live into because of how their bodies and their social circumstances are kept in a separate box by the broader society, right? And so she uses this to explore how marginalized groups sometimes end up competing with each other to present themselves as respectable within dominant regimes of moral value, and how significant that is. She's looking at the US context, but I think it works for the Americas broadly in terms of pitting different groups against each other in this battle to occupy a form of respectable subjectivity that they are all being excluded from by the dominant group. So just a plug there for one of my favorite books.
A mí me gustaría agregar solo una cosa a esto que me parece interesante como para desarmar un poco y preguntarnos también los pocos estudios que hay sobre la sociedad de acogida, ¿no? Todos nos centramos en estudiar al otro, al migrante, a la migrante, al indígena. ¿Qué pasa con las sociedades receptoras o con los que no son otros de nación, ¿no? Los homogéneos o los que están bien aceptados por esa imagen nacional, ¿no? Porque ahí se producen muchas tensiones también. ¿Cómo ve la sociedad al migrante y por qué lo ve así? ¿Cómo ve la sociedad al racializado, etnicizado y por qué lo ve así? ¿Y por qué consume determinados discursos también? ¿Por qué acepta y determinado trato hacia ciertas poblaciones, ¿no? Porque no se puede dejar por fuera, digo, porque volvemos como a poner, digo, sobre todo para la práctica, ¿no? Para la transformación concreta, el ojo de nuevo sobre aquellos que por ahí necesitan más nuestro sostén, ¿no? O nuestro apoyo. En ese sentido está bueno pensar también, lo digo para mí, ¿no? En esta reflexión, qué pasa con las sociedades mayoritarias o con las sociedades nacionales, en el caso nuestro que trabajo con migración, pero lo pienso para qué pasa con los que no son los otros.
Cecilia.
Sí, ahí me hizo acordar el comentario de Lucila a dos artículos muy importantes de Silke Stav y Mahler, no estoy segura cómo se pronuncia el otro apellido de la investigadora, que estudian cómo las personas de clase económica alta, los empleadores y trabajadoras domésticas, qué discursos y narrativas reproducen y cómo construyen su propia blanquitud, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en relación a la condición indígena o afrodescendiente de sus trabajadoras. Y cómo hay diferencias intrasocietales, ¿no? de clase social, como los de clase más alta, construyen narrativas étnico-raciales o con atravesamientos étnico-raciales sobre los más pobres, pero también se piensan como un homogéneo, todos los chilenos, frente a los peruanos que vienen a trabajar aquí, ¿no? Esas contradicciones de pensar el adentro y el afuera, y quién es el nosotros y quiénes son los otros, en cada situación. Como decía Neil, la movilidad de estas identidades y la incapacidad de agarrarlas, ¿no? Como de anclarlas según los contextos. Y gracias, Miranda, por la recomendación del libro, que suena muy interesante.
Gracias, Cecilia. Yo creo que nos ha acabado el tiempo, desafortunadamente. We have run out of time. But just wanted to thank once again our three speakers for a set of presentations that really challenged pretty much every border and boundary I can imagine, including, I think, very importantly, and I was very struck by this as well, the relationship between, you know, activism and academic activity, which is, of course, a boundary that many of us struggle with greatly. And I think that this particular set of papers helped us to understand how it is that we can integrate and consolidate those different sides of the equation. I also wanted to thank Kate Goldman and Kristen Collins for wonderful organization of this event thus far, which continues at 2 p.m. with the third panel. And we invite you to join back at that time after lunch, at least in this part of the world. And just wanted to say un verdadero gracias a ustedes por el trabajo. Thank you very much. Wonderful conversation, from which I learned a tremendous amount, and I look forward to the conversation in the future.
Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank
Cuídense
you.
mucho.
Gracias a todos.